A Dream Vision by Geoffrey Chaucer during the 14th century. The poem is the third longest of Chaucer's works, after the Canterbury Tales and Troilus and Chryside, and is possibly the first significant work in English to use the iambic pentameter or decasyllabic couplets which he later used throughout the Canterbury Tales. This form of the heroic couplet would become a significant part of English literature, possibly inspired by Chaucer. Geoffrey Chaucer, circa 1340s, the 25th of October 1400, was an English poet, author, and civil servant best known for the Canterbury Tales. He has been called the father of English literature, or, alternatively, the father of English poetry. He was the first writer to be buried in what has since come to be called Poets' Corner, in Westminster Abbey. Chaucer also gained fame as a philosopher and astronomer, composing the scientific treatise on the astrolabe for his 10-year-old son Louis. He maintained a career in the civil service as a bureaucrat, courtier, diplomat, and member of parliament. Prologue. The prologue describes how Chaucer is reprimanded by the god of love and his queen, Alceste, for his works, such as Troilus and Chryside, depicting women in a poor light. Chryside is made to seem inconstant in love in that earlier work, and Alceste demands a poem of Chaucer extolling the virtues of women and their good deeds. For thy trespass, an understand hit here. Thou shalt, while that thou livest, year by year, the most party of thy time spend in making of a glorious legende of good women, maidens and wives, that wherein true in love and all here lives, and telly of false men that hem betrayen, that all here life nay do not but a scion. The incomplete nature of the poem is suggested by Chaucer's retraction from the Canterbury Tales, which calls the work the XXV. Ladies, 15 and 19 are also numbers used to describe the work. In the prologue several women are mentioned: Esther, Penelope, Marcia Catone's wife of Cato the Younger, Lavinia, Polyxena and Laodamia, whose stories are not recorded, and the 19 ladies in waiting of Alceste mentioned in the prologue might suggest an unfulfilled structure. The Commendef Queen Alceste is said, by John Lydgate in The Fall of Princes, to be a poetic account of an actual request for a poem by Anne of Bohemia, who came to England in 1382 to marry Richard II. If true, this would make Chaucer an early poet laureate. Joan of Kent, Richard's mother, is also sometimes considered a model for Alceste. The supposed royal command is one suggested reason for the poem's unfinished state, as Chaucer got bored with the task and gave up. Several passages hint at Chaucer's dissatisfaction. But for I am agroted, stuffed, here by forn, to write of him that been in love forsworn, and eke to haste me in my legend, which to perform God me grace sende. Therefore I passe shortly in this wise. These lines, late in the poem, could simply be occupatio or paralipsis, the rhetorical device common in Chaucer of bringing up a subject merely to say you will not mention it. Whether the poem's state is due to Chaucer becoming bored with it is uncertain, but it is not regarded among his best work, despite being popular when first written. One early fan is Chaucer's own character, the man of law, who praises Chaucer in the poem which he calls Saint's Legende of Cupid. The work is rather inconsistent in tone, with tragedy mixed uncomfortably with comedy, and the legends are all somewhat similar, with little of the characterization which is key to the Canterbury Tales. Some scholars have conjectured that the work is deliberately poorly written and the work is actually a satire against women, although this is not widely agreed with. Another idea is that it is a satire on the idea of taking stories of classical origin and twisting them to give them contemporary moral meanings. This would suggest that the poem is not only an early use of heroic couplets but also one of the first mock-heroic works in English. The nature of the poem with its separate legends makes stating it difficult, but it is clearly placed between Troilus and the Tales around 1386–1388. Chaucer seems to have returned to the work a decade later to rewrite the prologue, but the latter text, which survives in only one manuscript, is generally considered inferior to the original. Athus on times have I heard men telly, That there is Ioi in heaven, and pain in Hela. And I accord well that it is so. But Nathals, yet wot I well also. That there ne's noon dwelling in this country. That either hath in heaven or Hela YB. Tennyson used the poem as theme for his own poem A Dream of Fair Women. Legends. The poet recounts 10 stories of virtuous women in 9 sections: Cleopatra, Thisbe, Medea, Phyllis, Hypsipyle, Ariadne, Lucretia, Philomene, Hypermnestra, Dido. The work is similar in structure to the later Monk's Tale, and like that tale, and many of his other works, seems to be unfinished. Chaucer's sources for the legends include Virgil's Aeneid, Vincent of Beauvais, Guido della Colon's Historia Destructionis Troiae, Gaius Julius Hyginus Fabulae, and Ovid's Metamorphoses and Heroids. The Legend of Cleopatra. Mark Antony leaves his wife, the sister of Octavian, in search for another wife. He finds Cleopatra and falls in love with her. They get married and have a great feast, but shortly after the feast Mark Antony learns that Octavian is still angry and is sailing to meet him. Cleopatra and Mark Antony sail out and meet Octavian. Mark Antony is defeated in battle, so to save his reputation he stabs himself. Cleopatra hears of the death of Mark Antony and mourns his death extensively. She had sworn that whatever happened to him, would happen to her. So she filled a pit next to Mark Antony's shrine with poisonous snake and laid herself into a final rest next to him. The Legend of Thisbe. Thisbe and Pyramus love each other dearly. However, they are not able to be together. They talked through the crack in the wall that separated their dwellings. They plan to meet at a tree later that evening. Thisbe arrives and sits under the tree waiting for Pyramus to show up. Suddenly a lion appears. The lion's mouth is covered in blood, so Thisbe decides to flee. While fleeing, she drops the veil that she was wearing. Pyramus finally arrives at the tree and finds the veil. He assumes the worst and decides to stab himself with his sword. Thisbe soon returns to find her lover dead. She takes the same sword and kills herself. The Legend of Dido. Aeneas is told by Venus that he is to seek out Dido and win her heart. When Aeneas is out hunting with Dido, it begins to storm. They run to seek shelter in a cave. They soon notice that they are alone in the cave. Aeneas confesses his love for Dido. At first, Dido refuses to confess that she loves Aeneas back. However, she finally admits to him that she loves him dearly. Aeneas begins to court Dido, but eventually he loses interest in Dido. He starts to plan how he will leave her and not return. Dido learns that he is trying to leave and she attempts to stop him from going. Aeneas leaves despite Dido trying to stop him. Dido then calls upon her sister to prepare a funeral arrangement. When Dido sees the funeral arrangement, she takes Aeneas' sword and stabs herself. The Legend of Hypsipyle and Medea. The intro of this legend calls Jason out for the way he lies to the 2 women about how he would die for love. The intro also state how the unfaithful lover will receive more delight than the faithful one. The Legend of Hypsipyle at beginning tells the reader that Jason is the king's nephew and then continues on to say he was once honorable. King Peleus, Jason's uncle, became worried that Jason would be so well liked, so he plotted to send him to his death. King Peleus told him that he wants him to go on a quest to find a treasure. He tells Jason that he will pick the men to go with him and pay for the expedition. Jason, being young and courage, accepts. He is granted a crew. Hercules is part of his crew and sails to the island where he meets Hypsipyle. Hypsipyle sent a man to ask is Jason required any help, and he tells the messenger to thank the queen, but they only want favorable winds. Jason meets the queen at the beach and greets her. She examines him and notes that he must be of nobility. Jason stays at Hypsipyle's a while waiting on the good wind. During the time Jason woos her. Jason eventually marries Hypsipyle and has children with her. He took all her property and then set sail and left her. She never saw him again. Hypsipyle decided to be faithful to her husband and dies alone and sad. The Legend of Medea starts off with Jason arriving at Colchis and he is looking for a woman to satisfy his lust. Jason goes to the king and requests permission to find the golden fleece. The king grants his request and is so honored that he sits Jason next to his daughter, Medea. Medea had previously heard of Jason's reputation and begins to fall in love with him. She tells him she is worried about him attempting to find the golden fleece. He tells her that he is honored that she is worried about his safety. She explains to him all the dangerous things he would face. She tells him that she can help save him from some of these dangers, but if she does he will become her faithful husband. Jason succeeded and he brought Medea across the sea to his homeland. However, Jason does the same thing to Medea that he did to Hypsipyle. He married her, took her treasures, had children with her and then abandons her. The legend of Lucretia. When Rome was under siege, Sextus Tarquinius goes to his friend Collatinus's house. They go in to see his wife, Lucretia, who was in her chambers with her hair down as she was not expecting visitors. She explains how she hopes Collatinus is safe and be home soon. Collatinus shows himself and she begins to cry and kiss him. Sextus Tarquinius looks at Lucretia and begins to examine her features. He desires her so badly that he decides he will make Lucretia his. He sneaks into her room and forces himself upon her. He makes her be submissive by placing his sword at her heart and threatening to kill a stable boy and place him there. Lucretia doesn't want to soil her good name, so she submits to him. After the act, Lucretia calls her husband, ladies, and parents. She explains the horrible act that occurred. She then explains that she doesn't deserve forgiveness. She then takes a knife and kills herself. The problem with two prologues. The story itself has two alternate prologues Chaucer authored for the story. The prevailing theory is that the contemporary criticism of the story following its release motivated Chaucer to sanitize or edit his prologue to be more fitting for the audience at hand. With Queen Anne in power, the topic of feminism was very much a hot-button issue. Chaucer's motivation for authoring the work in the first place is understood as a penance of his previous and unflattering depictions of women in his society. This factor could have had a strong influence on Chaucer to edit his original take. 1. There is a shorter and a longer of the two, and nobody can definitively assess which is the original and which is the edited. The context of the story, and the subject matter's relations to the other works of Chaucer tells us that it was most likely penned sometime in the midpoint of his career. 2. The authorship of the story is not known to an exact date, but the existence of these two prologues has helped to determine the specific period in Chaucer's career that the story was likely written. It has a practical significance in decoding Chaucer's career. The lack of information surrounding the story's publication and mysterious origins has influenced critics over the years to debate not only which of the two is the original version but also which is the superior one for the story. Contemporary English criticism and analysis of these two prologues has traditionally focused on the opening paragraphs of both versions, since the first half of both poems are largely identical. Some critics point to the story's purpose in its shared details between both versions of the prologue as the indicator of the story as a sort of ladies' handbook, based on the story's and characters' admirable femininity. 1. In the prologue itself, Chaucer states how its authorship was motivated by his previously ill portrayal of women in his other works. 3. Other critics take this sentiment of penance as the real indicator as to which of the two works is the original as well as the superiorly honest. If this were true, then the original version of the prologue would most likely be the more brutally honest of the two, perhaps the longer, less edited version. It has been argued that his continued unfavorable portrayal of his story's purpose in this prologue caused him to edit it down. 4. So, it's largely subjective what the reader will take the story as with these two differing contexts. Was Chaucer simply trying to sanitize his public image, or was he really adamantly motivated in creating a companion text for women to utilize? And, if so, how did these sentiments motivate the editing process? These are the essential questions that drive the critical conversation. The last essential detail of the debate between both prologues lies in the purpose of an analysis of the two, critically or practically. Lowes argues that the only real purpose we can get out of both versions of the prologue is to help determine the specific details and supposed authorship of the legend of good women or other Chaucerian tales, and that is rather useless to debate which version is superior since they are largely identical in the first place. Other critics like Goddard are interested in the person of Chaucer or his individual character. Was he really as good-willed as he comes off in his work, or was he really just pandering to his critics? This rift in criticism and analysis has largely dominated the existing critical spheres and permeated nearly decades of debate surrounding the story. Alternatively, other scholars have attempted to scatologically categorize these arguments and debates into definitive references of the ongoing conversation itself. 2. The most recent additions to the conversation more or less look like this: compendiums of the past critical analysis and prevailing hypothesis with a new theory presented at the conclusion. Importance of women to the poem. Women play an important role in Chaucer's collection of legendary stories, The Legend of Good Women. Not only do women make up the majority of the characters in the poem, but it is also thought that women form a large part of the audience for this poem as well. The most clear depiction of the importance of women to this piece would be the 10 female characters: Cleopatra, Thisbe, Dido, Hypsipyle, Medea, Lucrece, Ariadne, Philomela, Phyllis and Hypermnestra. All of these female characters are taken from classical legends and mythology, which Chaucer decides to retell in his own poem. Nicola F. MacDonald notes that throughout the narratives, Chaucer makes reference to his predominantly female audience and even questions them in the piece itself. These pagan mythological characters, whose stories all include love and betrayal, could serve as warnings and cautionary tales to the poem's female readers. 5. MacDonald also speculates that some of the text might serve as motherly advice to young women on how they should act and think properly during the time period, which would also support the idea that this poem was meant for a female audience. 5. Because it was controversial during the time period to show individualism, especially for women, Chaucer's style of writing in The Legend of Good Women could be read as both conservative and radical depending on who was reading it. Although this series of poems seems to be about the legends of these women and their difficulties with love, it has a political undertone that points to the controversial topic of individualism. Helen Phillips writes that Chaucer uses a specifically amorous tone in these poems to veil this controversy, while adding in political jargon to these otherwise unpolitical stories to still suggest this underlying topic. 6. Most likely the female audience would have read this story as a satire rather than as an informational story on how they should act, which is how the male audience would have read the poem. So, the women played an important role in interpreting this piece in the way that Chaucer intended. According to the prologue, it was Chaucer's intention to write 20 tales about good women. However, he ended up writing only 8, leaving the 9th unfinished. The theme of each tale is the fidelity of women in love. All of the women suffer, if not give their lives, for love. Within the text, they are all treated as admirable, even saintly, regardless of the potentially illicit nature of their romantic relationships. The women are often shown to suffer at the hands of men, who are portrayed as villainous. The longest and perhaps the most compelling tale is that of Dido's love for Aeneas. After Aeneas lands on the Libyan coast, his mother, Venus, instructs him to go to the court of Dido, the queen of Carthage. Dido offers him a warm welcome, feeling sorry for the disinherited hero who has taken such a long journey from Troy to be there. Her pity soon transforms into love, and she does everything within her power to comfort and entertain Aeneas. One day, Aeneas, Dido, and her retinue are hunting when they are caught in a thunderstorm. Everyone rushes to take shelter, and Dido and Aeneas find themselves huddled in a cave. Aeneas seizes the occasion to profess his love for Dido, and although she protests at first, Dido eventually concedes and admits her own love for him. Aeneas proceeds to do everything he can to court Dido and win her affections, but after a while, he grows weary and makes plans to leave. When Dido notices his waning affections, she asks him what is wrong. He fabricates a story in which he has had a vision of his father, reminding him of his destiny to conquer Italy. Dido pleads with Aeneas to stay, but he ignores her, returning to his ships without her. As soon as she discovers his absence, she has her sister build a funeral pyre upon which she stabs herself, using Aeneas's sword. In constructing this tale, Chaucer draws directly from Virgil's Aeneid, making only minor adjustments to the plot. Another tale in the poem draws from Ovid's Fasti. In order to prove his wife's loyalty, Collatinus offers to accompany Tarquin, the king's son, to Rome to see her. They listen in without her knowledge, as she is in her chamber, fretting over her husband's safety. Tarquin notices that Lucretia is very beautiful, and develops affection for her. His feelings increase until he is consumed with lust for her and makes a plan to return to seduce her. Tarquin sneaks into Lucretia's room at night, he threatens her with a sword and rapes her. Lucretia, determined that this travesty not negatively affect her husband, stabs herself to protect his honor. Toward the end of the poem, it appears that the poet has grown weary of the subject. As he set out to relay tales of perfect women, he created for himself a very narrow model with which to create these characters. Having to summarize them, he found that the women lacked characterization. In his effort to keep the tales brief, they often read like little more than summaries. The Legend of Good Women Summary. The Legend of Good Women is a collection of stories about women who were faithful in love. The stories are drawn from classical mythology, and all of them end tragically. The legend consists of a prologue and 9 stories, the last of which remains unfinished. The prologue is the most famous portion of the legend, and apparently a favorite of Chaucer's, as he revised it later in his career. It is a dream vision, a conventional form for medieval English poetry. In it, the poet goes out walking in the springtime. Admiring the flowers, he falls asleep and has a dream about Cupid, the Roman love god, and his queen Alceste. Cupid reprimands Chaucer for denigrating love by recounting the stories of unfaithful women in his long poem Troilus and Cressida and his translation of the satirical French romance The Roman de la Rose. However, Alceste defends Chaucer, arguing that he has also been responsible for many great poetic works, and thus deserves a chance to rescue his reputation by writing a work dedicated to the nobility of love and the faithfulness of women. Chaucer agrees, and wakes up to begin writing the poem. The stories themselves tend to follow a similar formula. With the exception of Medea, Ariadne, Philomela, and Hypermnestra, all the women end up dead at the end of their stories. Many kill themselves, whether to follow their beloveds to the grave Cleopatra and Thisbe out of grief at being betrayed by false men Dido, Hypsipyle, and Phyllis, or out of shame at having been raped Lucrece. A few of the men are faithful, most notably Pyramus in the legend of Pyramus and Thisbe, who kills himself because he believes Thisbe has been killed, but most are not. The legend uses repetitive storytelling to argue that women are faithful, even to the point of death, while men are fickle lovers, often motivated more by selfish desires for honor and wealth. Frequently, men promise marriage when convenient, only to abandon their betrothed at the first opportunity. These men are often familiar figures from classical mythology, including Jason, who recovers the Golden Fleece, Theseus, who slays the Minotaur, and Aeneas, the hero of Virgil's Aeneid. The legend centers their treatment of women rather than their heroic achievements, and thus casts them in a more negative light.